Have you noticed how every headline lately sounds the same? Government faces budget hole. Pensions under threat. Education, healthcare, infrastructure, no money. Different countries, different languages, different flags, and yet the same problem. Everyone is complaining that there is no money at exactly the same time. So here is the maddening question I want to ask you. How is it possible that almost every government on the planet is broke at the same time, while global debt is sitting at well over 200% of the world's annual production and public debt alone has climbed past $100 trillion and keeps rising? If everybody is drowning in obligations, then who exactly is on the other side of this deal? If every state is short of cash, who is rich enough to lend to almost all of them? The easy answers are comforting. It is the rich countries. It is China. It is shadowy bankers in New York or London. But once you zoom out, those simple villains stop working. The rich countries are also neck-deep in their own promises. China is one of the most indebted big economies on Earth. Major banks are not just lenders, they are also heavily reliant on government guarantees and emergency funding when things go wrong. The picture stops looking like a group of responsible adults lending to a handful of reckless teenagers. It starts to look like something much stranger, a room where everyone owes everyone and nobody can afford to leave. This is the story of why so many governments now behave like people who are permanently one paycheck away from trouble. Why "we have no money" has become the universal excuse, even in the wealthiest societies in human history. And why, when you hear that line, it usually does not mean there is literally no cash, but that the system itself is built so that nobody ever really feels safe. To understand how we got a world where being broke is basically the default setting, we have to start with something both obvious and uncomfortable. Modern states did this to themselves on purpose. Not because politicians are uniquely evil or uniquely foolish, but because over the past few decades, they quietly rewired the way the global economy works, in a way that makes almost every country fragile for exactly the same reasons, at exactly the same time. And once you see that pattern, it becomes very hard to unsee. Let me strip this down to its bare bones. A country is broke, in a political sense, long before it literally runs out of money. A government reaches that point when the amount it has promised to spend on pensions, healthcare, salaries, defense, interest on its debts, is so large that raising taxes enough to cover everything would trigger a revolt, and cutting spending enough to balance the books would also trigger a revolt. That is the true meaning of the phrase, "there is no money." There is money. There is output. There are workers, resources, machines, data centers, solar farms. What there is not is a painless way to rearrange all those things so that the books look neat again. If you want a mental image, think of a household that is not starving, not homeless, but every month is juggling credit card payments, mortgage, car loan, school fees, medical bills. The family eats, the lights stay on, but the slightest shock, a job loss, an illness, a broken boiler, and everything bends to the breaking point. Now enlarge that picture to the size of a country. This was not always normal. For most of history, rulers did not have the tools to be permanently broke. A medieval king could certainly run out of silver, default on a loan, or anger his creditors, but the scale was limited. He could not easily borrow the equivalent of an entire year of his kingdom's production because the financial system to do that simply did not exist. As economies grew more complex, debt matured from a private promise between neighbors into a state-level technology. In early modern Europe, city-states and kingdoms learned that they could pool the wealth of their citizens, print elegant pieces of paper stating, "We owe you this much plus a little extra later," and trade those pieces of paper like any other asset. Government IOUs turned into bonds. Bonds turned into markets. Markets turned into a permanent habit. Whenever the state wanted something big, a war, a railway, a welfare program, it would not wait to save. It would borrow against the future. Fast forward to the 20th century. After 2 world wars, the global economy tried to put itself on a leash. Currencies were loosely tied to the dollar was tied to gold, and in theory that metallic anchor was supposed to limit how far governments could stretch their ambitions. But ambition has never been good at obeying gold. By the early 1970s, the United States and other major economies had created far more dollars and promises than they had metal in vaults to back them. The link snapped. One by one, currencies stopped pretending to be redeemable for anything physical. Money became a pure legal construct, something that exists because the state says it exists. That transition to purely state-backed money changed everything. Once governments were no longer constrained by gold, the main thing stopping them from borrowing more was fear. Fear of inflation, fear of angry voters, fear of markets refusing to lend. For a while, that fear held. Then, the next ingredient arrived: a long era of falling interest rates. From the early 1980s until very recently, the cost of borrowing in most advanced economies kept drifting downward. Every time there was a shock, a recession, a crisis, a bubble bursting, central banks cut their policy rates to soften the blow. When the global financial system almost collapsed in the late 2000s, they slashed those rates to levels that would once have looked absurdly low and then kept them there for years. Cheap money does two things. First, it makes debt look painless. When you can roll over an old bond into a new one that costs less to service, the temptation to borrow just a bit more is overwhelming. Why raise taxes and get voted out if you can instead quietly sell more bonds and spread the pain over decades? Second, it encourages everybody, households, firms, and states, to treat debt like oxygen rather than medicine. Mortgages stretch longer. Corporate leverage rises. Public finances become built on the assumption that borrowing will always be easy and affordable. By the time the pandemic hit in the year 2020, this logic was already baked into the system. Governments all over the world had entered the crisis with heavy backpacks of existing promises. Then the virus arrived and forced them to sprint uphill. Lockdowns crashed private activity. Tax revenues fell. To prevent a depression, states stepped in as spenders of last resort. They funded wage subsidies, emergency health care, business support, direct transfers. And because they could not collect much extra tax in the middle of an emergency, they turned to the same familiar tool. They borrowed. In that single year, public debt worldwide jumped by the equivalent of more than 10% of global output. Money that would otherwise have circulated through normal markets came instead from central banks and bond investors buying record amounts of government IOUs. In the short run, it worked. The world avoided a collapse on the scale of the Great Depression. But there was a catch, and you are living in the aftermath of it now. Economists like to talk about shocks as if they are independent events. Financial crisis here, pandemic there, war or energy crunch somewhere else. In reality, they layer on top of each other. They interact. After the worst of the pandemic passed, the world did not return to the calm, low-inflation environment of the early 2010s. Supply chains were tangled, energy prices surged, geopolitical tensions flared. Inflation spiked at levels advanced economies had not seen in decades. The cure, in the textbook, is simple. Raise interest rates. Make borrowing more expensive, cool demand, slow the rise in prices. And that is precisely what central banks did. The trouble is that this cure landed on a world where almost everyone was already leveraged to the hilt. Households with mortgages, firms with loans, and, crucially for our story, governments with mountains of bonds all felt the same pressure at once. Those higher rates did not just make it harder for you to take out a new loan. They raised the price tag of every future refinancing a state would have to do as old bonds matured. In other words, the bill for the years of cheap borrowing started to arrive. According to recent international estimates, gross public debt has climbed to around $111 trillion in the year 2025, having risen by more than $8 trillion in a single year. Organizations that track these things warn that, unless policies change, government debt will likely reach a level close to the entire annual output of the global economy before the end of this decade, And that is not just a rich country problem. Developing economies now carry around $8 and a bit trillion in external public and publicly guaranteed debt. They spent roughly $1 and nearly $500 billion servicing foreign debt in the year 2023 alone, with interest payments at a 20-year high, diverting money away from health, education, and climate adaptation. The World Bank and other bodies warn that the gap between what these countries must pay and what they can easily borrow has blown out to a 50-year extreme. So when you hear that governments in Europe, Africa, Latin America, or Asia all complain about no fiscal space, they are not copying each other's excuses. They are reacting to the same underlying math. Here is the paradox I want you to sit with. On paper, the world has never been richer. Global output, even after inflation, towers above what earlier generations could imagine. Technological capacity is staggering. Yet from Washington to Rome, from Accra to London, from Buenos Aires to Tokyo, finance ministers flip through their spreadsheets and see the same ugly equation. Large existing debt, rising interest costs, slow growth, aging populations, voters who hate cuts and hate tax rises even more. So why does it feel as if every country is broke at once? There are 4 big forces tying their hands together. The first is demographics. In many advanced economies, societies are getting older. Japan is the poster child here, with public debt estimated at well over twice its yearly output, in part because decades of slow growth and a shrinking workforce have made it harder to fund pensions and healthcare out of current taxes. Europe and North America are not far behind. The ratio of retirees to workers is climbing, and the promises made to older generations are politically untouchable. Meanwhile, many developing countries have the opposite problem: a very young population that needs jobs, schools, infrastructure. They cannot realistically slam the brakes on investment without risking social instability. But they also face higher borrowing costs, so every new highway or power plant funded with foreign loans pushes them closer to the edge. The second force is what you might call expectation lock-in. Over the post-war decades, citizens in rich democracies came to expect that the state would act as a safety net and as a problem solver of last resort. Healthcare, unemployment insurance, disaster relief, bank rescues, when the financial system plays with matches and sets itself on fire, all of that flows through government balance sheets. Once you build those systems, rolling them back is politically explosive. Voters anchor their sense of fairness to them. Even in countries with less generous welfare states, people now look to the state for fuel subsidies, food support, price caps, or cash transfers whenever there is a shock. Every crisis ratchets expectations up, rarely down. The third force is hyper-connected finance. Capital can zip around the planet faster than news. That means if investors lose confidence in one country, they can dump its bonds in hours. If a big central bank raises rates, the ripple in global borrowing costs is felt from Nairobi to New Delhi. This financial web has a strange side effect. It disciplines and enables at the same time. On one hand, states fear being punished by markets. If debt looks too high or politics too chaotic, interest rates can spike. On the other hand, when times seem calm, the same global investors are eager to buy government bonds in bulk because they are liquid, standardized, and, compared to many alternatives, still seen as safe. So governments across the world end up feeding from the same trough. The fourth force is what I would call the rollover habit. Most modern states no longer think of debt as something that must be paid back to zero. They think of it as a permanent feature, like a river that never dries up. Old bonds mature, new bonds are issued, and as long as the total stock does not explode too fast and investors keep buying, the machine keeps humming. That mentality is not necessarily reckless on its own. Companies roll over debt. Households refinance mortgages. The problem arises when this permanent debt machine collides with higher interest costs and lower growth at the same time, which is exactly where we are. Let us make this more concrete. Take the United States. The federal government's public debt is now well above its yearly output. A decade ago, interest payments were manageable because rates were low. Now, with yields higher, the share of the budget eaten by servicing past borrowing is rising fast. Every additional dollar that goes to bondholders is a dollar that cannot be spent on infrastructure, education, or climate resilience without either raising taxes or cutting something else. Cross the Atlantic. Countries like Italy or the United Kingdom entered the recent inflation spike with heavy debt burdens already in place. Italy's public debt has hovered around 1.25 times its yearly output. Britain cites close to or above its own national income. When rates rose, markets started to ask hard questions about how long those debt paths could stay stable, especially if growth remained sluggish and politics fractured. Each government, when faced with demands for more hospitals, better schools, higher defense spending, or tax cuts, discovered the same cold truth. There is very little fiscal room left that does not upset somebody. Move to the global south. Countries like Ghana, Zambia, Sri Lanka, and others have already gone through painful restructurings in recent years, renegotiating tens of billions of dollars in external debt because they simply could not meet the original terms. Many more nations now spend more on interest and principal payments to foreign creditors than on critical public services at home. When they say they are broke, they are not exaggerating. They are taking money that could have gone to clinics or schools and wiring it abroad to keep the system from declaring them officially in default. What ties all these cases together is not that the numbers are identical. It is that the structure is. Everyone spent decades building a model where future growth would comfortably outrun today's borrowing. Then growth slowed, populations aged, shocks accumulated, and the cost of money turned upward. The model did not collapse outright, but it stopped feeling safe. It started to feel cramped. That is why the word broke shows up so often now. It is not a precise technical term. It is a political mood that emerges when there is no painless way to satisfy all the promises made. There is also a more personal dimension to this story, one that is easy to miss when we are tossing around trillion-dollar figures. Remember what public debt actually is. It is not just anonymous bonds in trading algorithms. It is the flip side of your savings, your pension pot, your insurance policy. When you put cash into a retirement fund, that fund does not bury it in the ground. It buys assets, and government bonds are often its favorite because they are seen as the closest thing to risk-free in a risky world. In many advanced economies, pension funds and insurance companies hold a large portion of their assets in sovereign bonds for exactly that reason. That means a country can be broke in the sense of not having enough fiscal room to spend freely, while at the same time millions of its citizens depend on that very same government's debt as the bedrock of their future security. This is the loop. Citizens demand services and safety. Governments borrow to provide them. The borrowed money often comes from the citizens' own savings, routed through financial institutions. As interest is paid, that income flows back to savers and investors, who then reinvest some of it, often in new government bonds. When rates were low, this loop felt like a gentle, almost harmless circle. With higher rates, it becomes tighter. Retirees might welcome better returns on their bond-heavy portfolios, but taxpayers and younger workers shoulder the burden of higher interest bills through squeezed budgets and slower public investment. So when a finance minister says, "We cannot afford to do more," she is not only complaining about a number on a screen, she is pointing at a delicate political balance. Tilt too far toward new promises, and markets may worry. Tilt too far toward austerity, and voters may revolt. The end result is paralysis that looks and feels like universal poverty, even in societies that are objectively wealthy. Here is another way to think about it. Imagine the world's governments as passengers in a single, very large airplane. For decades, the pilots flew with the tailwind of falling interest rates and steady, if uneven, growth. The cabin crew promised more comfort, more amenities, more upgrades. Passengers got used to it. Then the wind shifted. Fuel got more expensive. The engines aged. Some sections of the plane became overcrowded. But instead of landing, overhauling the aircraft, and resetting expectations, the crew did what was easiest politically. They kept promising, kept borrowing, and hoped the turbulence would pass. Now everyone feels the shaking at the same time. Rich countries, poor countries, those with strong institutions and those without, all of them are strapped into the same airframe of global finance. When central banks in a handful of major economies change course, the pressure in the cabin changes for everyone. When a crisis forces one government to borrow heavily, it sets precedents and expectations that others will follow in their own emergencies. That is why the sensation of being broke is synchronized. It is not that every state has exactly the same budget number, it is that every state is flying the same kind of plane in the same storm with passengers who now expect a level of comfort that the engines can barely support. So, can this go on? Can we live indefinitely in a world where governments hover on the edge of no money while debt keeps creeping higher relative to the size of the economy? International organizations warn that continuing on the current path without reforms will mean more frequent debt crises, especially in vulnerable countries, and a growing share of public budgets locked into servicing past obligations instead of investing in the future. But here is the uncomfortable twist. Stopping abruptly is just as dangerous. If states everywhere tried to balance their books overnight, slashing spending, hiking taxes, refusing to roll over debt, the result would almost certainly be a brutal global downturn. Investment would dry up, safety nets would be pulled away, demand would fall. The very growth that is supposed to make debts manageable would stall or reverse. That is the trap of a highly indebted world. Go forward, and you worry about a slow grind of higher interest burdens, fragile politics, and periodic crises. Slam on the brakes, and you risk a severe recession, or worse. Either way, the illusion that governments have limitless space to fix every problem is fading. What does that mean for you and me? It means that when you read that your country cannot afford something, a new hospital, a better pension, a climate project, it is not always a lie or a sign of unique corruption. Often, it is a reflection of this shared structural bind. It also means that the conversations we have about living within our means can no longer be purely national. A small state cannot escape the gravity of global rates. A developing economy cannot insulate itself completely from the decisions made in Washington, Frankfurt, or Beijing. A rich democracy cannot pretend its public debt is entirely its own business when its bonds are held in pension funds around the world. We really are in this together, for better and for worse. I am not going to pretend there is a neat, hopeful answer waiting at the end of this story. There is no single magic reform that makes every country solvent, every promise sustainable, and every voter happy. But I will leave you with this. When you next hear a politician in any language say, "There is no money," listen more carefully. Ask yourself what they really mean. Are they talking about the real capacity of their society? Its workers, its ideas, its land, its technology? Or are they talking about the narrow space left inside a financial machine built over decades, a machine that now creaks under the weight of all the promises fed into it? Because the true puzzle of our age is not just why every country seems broke at the same time, it is whether we are willing to admit that broke is not just a number, but a choice about how we have designed the rules. And if we designed them this way, in theory, we could design them differently. The question is not only whether we can afford to change them, it is whether, before the next storm hits, we dare to try.